I can hear you.
Hello, ngHouston. You're supposed to mute, Reggie.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, we have feedback here. Okay, so we're live at blinds.com, and there's always little technical tricks when we're live, but we are live at blinds.com. Everybody say hello. Hi. Yay. Okay, and last month we had Jeff Whelpley, and we were super excited, and then we had technical difficulties halfway through, and Jeff didn't get to finish his talk, so we brought Jeff back to talk about cloud DevOps. And also this time we have bonus content. Reggie Davis is thrown in for just for fun. Yeah. So I'm going to pass it over. So Reggie's our host here at blinds.com, and he's awesome. And Jeff is online joining us remotely. And so I'm going to pass it to Reggie and Jeff to teach us all about cloud DevOps.
All right, Jeff, we're live. Thanks, Reggie. Yeah, and actually it was really funny because my internet connection totally busted last month. Well, I was right in the middle of my presentation, but I did not realize it because I had my slides up and was giving the presentation, and I had no idea. And I literally was talking for another 20 minutes. Like I watched the episode of when I got cut out, and my wife was sitting here listening to me, and I was making all sorts of dramatic gestations with my hands at the end and loud noises and I don't know what, but it was all for naught. I guess it was just for the entertaining of my wife. But it's great to be back because so much more to say. And Reggie and I have basically been talking over the course of the last month about some other ways to talk about this content, which is essentially DevOps and cloud services for the modern age, and talking about the best way as developers and Angular developers to utilize the cloud. And one thing we talked about was potentially, thinking, because Reggie's had a ton of experience on the AWS side. I've been doing a lot of stuff on GCP, and we both know both sets of services pretty well, is to set up some comparisons of things that probably most of you developers have started to think about and really get into details about what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of the different options available. And I think some of that, in getting into some of that discussion, I think we'll probably touch on some of the topics I talked about last time and maybe some new stuff as well. And I think to get started, it's something where we wanted to go over a couple things that we had planned, but also anybody there in the room, if you want to bring up anything as well. Does that pretty much cover, Reggie, what you were thinking about as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you covered it very, very well.
Cool. So the first thing that we wanted to talk about, which is a very common thing these days to use a NoSQL database. I know there's a lot of still people using regular relational SQL databases as well, but a lot of Angular developers that I know utilize NoSQL databases, and there's a lot of different options out there, both with comparing AWS and GCP, but also just even within each side of things, there's different options. And so, Reggie, why don't you kind of break down some of the different options and talk about your thoughts there, and then I'll throw mine in afterwards.
Absolutely. So let me just give you guys just a little bit more background about what I do. So I am essentially a DevOps engineer here for the Home Depot. And a lot of the things that I do are very much so cloud-based. So I interact with all the services, everything from EC2 instances all the way to Lambda, even the database layer. And even right now, we're still continuing to adopt DevOps practices into our current workflow. And just as much as this is going to be a technical talk, I definitely want people to understand this will also be a cultural talk, because for a lot of people, the cloud is very different. And to completely embrace a cloud, you have to think about the cloud in a very different way than what you would probably typically think about an on-prem infrastructure. One of the first services, I think the most obvious service to start off talking about is definitely the VM services that both cloud providers offer. AWS offers EC2 instances, and as does GCP offers the compute engine instances. They're both very similar as far as like their offering and the features that they offer, which to be completely honest with you, and Jeff, I would love to hear some commentary on what I'm about to say. I think if you're going to the cloud to just use VMs, you're not using the cloud the right way.
I think that's crazy.
I think some people probably would think it's crazy, but I honestly think that us talking about EC2 instances is no different than talking about on-prem infrastructure or using some hypervisor on-prem.
Well, yeah, I mean, there is a little bit. So I agree with you in general, but
okay.
But just yeah, I worked in a big corporation as well, and maybe things have probably changed from the days when I was at Wells Fargo. But the one thing that was a big difference, besides what you mentioned, was the ownership. Where when we were dealing with on-prem, we had to go through the gatekeepers of this networking team that was not, very well versed in the cloud and kind of enabling teams. They were sort of just more slowing everybody down. Whereas like when we did utilize just even if it was VMs through like AWS at that time, we had like free reign. So like that part you saw, but I do agree with you that really the main goal or the one of the major advantages is pay for what you use. And
Absolutely.
If you are using just the VM level only, then you're almost certainly overpaying still.
Absolutely, I absolutely agree. We've seen the pain of using VMs in the cloud, and it can be very very expensive. I would definitely say for some situations it is. I think VMs are necessary, depending, especially if you're migrating and you don't want to make too much of a drastic change. I think there's not a problem with using VMs, but I think somewhere down the line, I think there should eventually be some conversations of how can we start migrating these VMs over into maybe like a PaaS service or maybe a container service, things like that. They can actually be managed by the cloud, so you can actually take advantage of a lot of the resources and features that the cloud gives you, such as auto scaling, disaster recovery, things of that nature.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, at the end of the day, at least it sounds like you came from more been doing infrastructure for a while, but like even though I'm doing that now, like I am a developer still, and I want to care about just writing code and
absolutely
out there. And like the less you have to think about the actual infrastructure, the better.
Absolutely, and that is the whole point. Because I do work more on the infrastructure DevOps side. That's like my whole goal for all of my developers. I don't want my developers to have to worry about the underlying OS and what services and all those things they need. Like that's not something that I feel like a developer should have to worry about. I feel like the developer should only have to worry about writing code, and wherever the code gets deployed, it should be able to run. And I think that's what the cloud definitely provides whenever you actually like take the time to think about it and plot out your course accordingly to your developers. Because I think that's the whole thing is, like you said, there's always been that fence between developers and infrastructure. But once you start actually embracing DevOps, there's no longer that fence, because now you guys are actually working together, and there's not this divide of like, hey, I don't know how to troubleshoot this code because I never wrote it, because you're working right there alongside with your teammates. Yeah,
definitely. And there is, different levels of, so if you don't want to work at the VM level, they have the different, Docker containers or serverless, which is essentially still Docker, but it's just, you can scale to 0 instead of having like, 1 always reserved or whatever, but it's to the point that you should be able to get really granular. And if you set up auto scaling correctly, which it can be in some cases tricky to do that correctly, and it may be application specific in some cases, so that it actually scales up and down correctly, which is some people don't necessarily take the time to do either, which then even if you set up auto scaling, you might be overpaying if you don't do that correctly. But all the tools are there, which is great.
Absolutely, absolutely. Did you want to go ahead and move on to the next service? Did you want to pick one and go for it, or
Yeah. So I do want to do the databases and the NoSQL databases.
let's talk about it?
Yeah. So I mean, let me set it up, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts. So like, um, I think most application developers or Angular developers that I know do use some sort of NoSQL database, Mongo traditionally, but and you can, of course, any database or any software you can run on a VM in the cloud. But there's a lot of hosted services now that, frankly, just make your life easier, just because they handle all of the scaling and potential infrastructure problems with it. So both on the AWS side and the Google side, they have a number of services, and I think for me, even up until I don't know, like 4 months ago when I really started getting into this, like it was kind of confusing, like the different options of and what the advantages and disadvantages are. So I'd love to hear your thoughts first, Reggie, of like how you would break it down, and then yeah, I'd definitely add my 2 cents too.
Um, so when I think about databases, especially in the cloud, I know I've had experience with dealing with a database on-prem and actually having to manage the database layer, specifically SQL Server.
Oh
And
my God, it's horrible.
yeah, it's terrible. It's really, really bad. And I think databases is always a technology or a service to me that I always feel like if I can hand this off to someone else and allow them to manage it and keep it updated and make sure all the tables are right and all of those kinds of things, then I'm going to go for that all day, every day. Because DBA work is very difficult and time consuming. And the more time that you are as a team or as a developer are having to worry about the database and things of that nature, like the less time you actually have to develop. So I'm all about going to the cloud in regards to using a hosted service in regards to a database. I know GCP has several hosted database services as well as AWS. I know they have the RDS on the AWS side. And I know on the Google side, which is, I think, probably one of the best, if not the best hosted database service, is probably Firebase. I've used Firebase on several occasions, just kind of testing out apps with like serverless functions and microservice architecture, and it just works. It just works. Like you can set it up and like that's it. Like you can kind of really just go off and do whatever you need to do.
And by the way, if you want to see what that actually looks like to set up like an Angular app without a server, we have a really good episode of ngHouston from about a year ago called Serverless Angular.
Yeah.
With Reggie Davis. And I think that was like one of the first ones that we ever live streamed. That was like
yes.
On.
Yes, it was.
It was a really good episode, and it's on YouTube, so you can go back and look it up.
It's fun. It was definitely fun. I learned a lot with that one. I think it's one of those things where, like once again, like if you can hand that off to the cloud and let the cloud just kind of go and do its thing, I think that's the most optimal thing you can do. Especially when you're moving towards DevOps, because typically DevOps teams that I've seen, I don't see DBAs on those teams, and most people don't have experience with SQL to that extent to even warrant to even have somebody like that on the team.
Yep, definitely.
Yes.
About the serverless episode?
Yes. So for anybody that has any interest in seeing how Angular app would work with Firebase and serverless, about a year ago, I did a talk for ngHouston about hooking up a Angular 2 app with a serverless backend and Firebase on the backend as well. Definitely kind of like a step towards microservices architecture. It was very fun because I didn't get it to work, and I actually talk about how what kind of issues you will actually run into whenever developing an application with serverless functions as your backend.
That's cool. I'm gonna have to check that out.
Good times. Good times.
Yeah, one thing I would mention is that, or add to what you said, is that there actually are 3 different NoSQL options on the Google Cloud side, which I again was sort of confused by up until recently, because they do have the Firebase real-time database, which is what you were talking about and it's been around for a little while, is definitely a good database for building front-end apps and having something quick to use. Then there is a data store, which is been around for a while within the main Google Cloud Platform offerings. And more recently, they have Firestore. And I didn't really understand how they all kind of played together, but from my more recent understanding, after talking to some people from the Firebase team during a recent Google Developer Expert event when we were hanging out with the Googlers, is that basically, Firestore is something that the Firebase team built on top of Data Store and they basically took the Data Store code base and added a lot of the cool features from Firebase to that. The Firebase database is great, but it really can't be used or shouldn't be used as kind of a system of record for any kind of like high throughput for sure. Like it's great for enabling like chat applications and things like that, but you would never want to put your like mission critical, especially like high throughput stuff, on the Firebase real-time database, just because it doesn't have the consistency level and robustness and backups and all that type of stuff that's needed. But building on top of Data Store, which is like really robust, they sort of get some of that. So, looking forward in the future, when you try to create a database now, either within the Firebase side of things or on the like Google Cloud in the main Google Cloud console, it does prompt you to try to encourage you to use Firestore. And it's not, but they aren't like forcing you to, because it's still technically in beta. But as soon as that comes out, I'm sure there'll be kind of more and more pushing you to do that. And now there is 2 different modes where it's this is still, I guess, something I'm still not totally clear on, but they do have Firestore in different modes, in the real-time mode or the data store mode, which I think essentially, from what I've seen, just makes a difference in the API that you use. So the Firestore API is much more similar to the Firebase API, which allows you to stream data to your app and that type of thing. Whereas the Data Store API is more traditional, NoSQL, like more like a Mongo interface.
Absolutely, cool. So did you want to go ahead and move towards the CDN and the static hosting layer, since we're
and I think this is an interesting topic, because I would imagine most people who are Angular developers do static hosting at one point or another, right?
Absolutely. So we had one question in the crowd. Yes, sir.
You mentioned you worked in Wells Fargo a long time ago. So do you think that the Wells Fargo, they have a financial transaction? They can use yours in Firebase or something? That's such a good question.
So Jeff, so we had a gentleman in the crowd ask about your experience at Wells Fargo, and he was basically asking, since it is a financial institution, do you think that they would use a service like a Firebase, a data store, to store critical like PII information into a cloud database?
Or even what do we say if our project owner says, I don't trust the security in the cloud?
So no, this is actually a very good question. I just passed the Google Cloud Architect exam, and this topic that you're bringing up is like one of the key things they keep on drilling into your head. So the first thing I would say, let me disambiguate. So the Firebase database, I probably wouldn't use at the bank. The traditional Firebase real-time database, it doesn't necessarily have like all the features that would be needed in order to justify it to your higher ups. But Firestore, which is built on Data Store, most definitely you can. So Google has been making a huge push to make inroads in the enterprise. And I mean, it's similar to stuff that's going on the Amazon side as well, in terms of like offerings to make it easier to do hybrid cloud environments and that type of thing, but also for security. And so Google in particular has taken a number of steps, which I think are super smart. Like, for example, one of them being that they have enabled throughout the entire Google Cloud Platform for everybody that encryption is on by default, at rest, and in transit. It's something that on the AWS side, by default, it's not. And you actually have to explicitly, make sure you set it up or whatever. And so you can, like, to fulfill your security requirements, you can do it on both sides for sure. But I think there's some amount of like good feeling there that Google kind of like does that for you by default. And the other thing, just other than like the fact that they definitely have the proper level of encryption and security constraints, they have like auditing tools that are built in that you can that are really seriously specifically built for these auditors. At Wells Fargo, we had this auditing team that would come in all the time. I mean, at first when I was there, it was only like every couple of years I would see them, but then near the end, it was like almost on a constant basis to ask us, like they'd be constantly reviewing our deployments and architectures and whatever. And both Google and Amazon have built tools specifically for this group of people to be able to very easily see and audit what you're doing. So there are plenty of use cases, and if you are interested, I can send you links after the fact where Google, I know for sure on the Google side, and I'm sure on the AWS side they have it too, where basically they showcase somebody. I forget where there was a bank or something similar to the one I'm thinking about, where they showcase this company that moved all their stuff to the cloud and fulfilled all of the high security and auditing requirements that were necessary. So this is something that they have definitely thought about and do fulfill. In my mind, it's really just a mental. At this point, it's not anything real why people don't do it. It's more that just because they're afraid.
Lack of understanding, probably.
Yeah, exactly. Do you agree with what I'm saying, Reggie?
I absolutely agree, because I've seen that a lot. I actually just got back from a cybersecurity conference this weekend, and I think there's always going to be that natural fear of, well, I'm storing this sensitive data into the cloud. Like, where is this staying at? What's going on? I mean, just as a heads up, like as far as AWS is concerned, or really any of the cloud providers are concerned, like the underlying infrastructure, like they secure that. And I guarantee their security is probably a lot more tighter than what you may have in your own office. So I would trust that they are making very, very, very well that sure that your data is very secure. But I think outside of that, I think you still need to go about securing your data and your infrastructure the same way you would as an on-prem system. Thinking about your endpoints, thinking about your APIs, thinking about encrypted data, in transit, all of those things. At the end of the day, those things are still the responsibility of the end user who's building up this infrastructure using the cloud. So you still think of security the same way. It's just that the difference is going to be that that sensitive data is not going to be hosted in maybe like some local server farm or anything like that. It's going to be hosting in maybe a server farm that AWS hosts or holds, whether it's in East Virginia or in the Midwest or wherever.
By the way, just one last thing on this topic. I feel like from talking to the Google Cloud team that they talk to so many businesses, like, and this type of thing comes up so many times, that they have exhaustively added stuff that probably isn't used by so many people, I would imagine, but have done it just to make them feel better. like there's stuff on there like Google has a thing called shielded VMs that is hardened virtual machines, like that are like super duper like army level secure. Like I don't even know what it's something that I would never use. It's super expensive and like whatever, but literally add that type of stuff in there just so that there can be no excuse. Like, so when they talk to, you know, a Wells Fargo or whatever else, and they actually have a conversation and they bring up like, oh, we need a key fob and we need all this other stuff. Oh, well, okay, here we go. We already have it. Done.
Sounds good to me. Did that answer your question? Cool. All right, cool. So we can move on to the CDN and the static hosting, which I think for most people that I've talked to about their initial migration to the cloud, like typically a S3 service or object store is typically the first place that they actually begin using the cloud, which I think is awesome because of the simple fact that if you want to host things like images or JPEGs or things of that nature, I think those buckets, those S3 buckets, and as well as the Google buckets are like the perfect places for those things, because I think very often, what I've seen from old infrastructure, typically people will store those kinds of things on some type of network share or something like that. Like people had all kinds of weird places to store those kinds of things, or they just store it on a server. And I think when you can kind of centralize those kinds of documents into a place like a S3 or some type of a Google bucket or anything like that, I think it definitely just simplifies your solutions a whole lot more.
Yeah, and I definitely think S3 and Google Cloud Storage are both like good solutions, but I also think that Firebase, again, with their storage solution, which underneath the scenes it uses Google Cloud Storage anyways, but they just created a really nice developer-friendly API on top of it. And it's not. I mean, it's static hosting, right? Like it's not. There's only so much that you can do. It's not. There's not solving curing cancer or something, but they just do a really good job. I use for a lot of my websites. In fact, even one that I was showing Bonnie earlier that I'm in the process of launching the next couple days. I use Firebase static hosting, even though I use other GCP services. In other words, instead of the core Google storage service, I use the Firebase storage service just because of the API, essentially. That it makes it easy for developers.
Yes.
Will you do me a favor?
Yes.
Will you click on that link that I just sent you and put it up and mute it? Because you're looking at Jeff and we feel left out over here. So if you put yourself up there, then like.
Okay, so you want me to put up the link? All right, let me.
Open that in another tab and then mute that tab. Actually, no. You know what? That's not really good because then we're gonna have it on a delay.
Okay, so you want me to leave it alone?
Don't do that. Don't listen.
Okay, I will not listen to you. All right, no problem. Yeah, no.
Remember to look at us sometimes.
Okay, I will definitely look over at you guys. I don't have a problem with that. Some of y'all, I don't have a problem with looking at. I don't know about the rest of y'all. But yeah, no, I think no, there's no super magic going on with static hosting and S3 buckets. But I think it's really fun because I've done things like throwing an Angular front end into S3 bucket and had it talk to the back end and things like that. Like I think with the S3 buckets, like it may seem limited, but you can actually do a lot more with it than what meets the eye. Especially, I know go for it.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, in fact, I would avoid the setting up for a web server or a dynamic web server if you can at all costs. I mean, it's just extra work and compute power and whatever. If you can static host stuff, you definitely should.
Absolutely. And then I think on top of that, even with the S3 buckets, so let's say you want to host a static website, they only charge you by how much space you take up versus, per minute or per hour that you would if you were to set up a VM or anything like that, or some other cloud hosted solution in the cloud. So it actually ends up being a lot cheaper for you.
Cheaper and faster.
Yes.
This might be a super beginner question because I have not done hardly anything with serverless or cloud. I know a lot of stuff about Angular, but I don't know anything about cloud. Right?
Okay.
So if I just need like Firebase, right? Firebase is completely beautiful and simple, especially when you're first getting started.
Yes.
It's just so quick to just roll it up, right? So if I wanted to go to the next level, I can fire up a Firebase pretty easily.
Correct.
And I can like hook up the development. But say I'm just doing a quick proof of concept, but but I want to have like, I don't want to use Firebase. I want to like have my own like containerized database.
Mm-hmm.
What would be the easiest way to do that for someone who's like, beginner? Like, I just want to have like a super easy database, and that's pretty much like baby steps, right? What would you recommend?
So the question was, Bonnie, the lovely host, asked, what would be a very simple, quick way to use some type of containerized database or anything of that nature in the cloud for someone that's just beginning or would like to have some level of, I guess, like level 1 experience with the cloud and databases?
Yeah, so I have my, I mean, it's part of this is, you mentioned, Reggie, before about like some of this is like cultural personal preference, like, and I do think that's the case. So I have my own personal preferences for certain recommendations, so I can definitely reel those off. So like for me, almost every application I build now, it is, Firestore for the database. It's Google Cloud, Firebase static hosting. And then the CDN, which we haven't talked about then, I actually, if it's an SEO site, I do something different, whether it's an SEO site or not. So like if you care about SEO, like SEO and search ranking, if you don't, and it's more of an internal app or something that you don't necessarily care as much about SEO, I would just use the internal, on the Google Cloud side, I would just use the Google Cloud CDN, because when you use everything, all of the stuff within the same cloud, it makes it easier for doing some things like blue-green deployments, or like stuff where you want all the services to work together like more seamlessly. But if you like actually have like a really stringent performance requirements where like you kind of are going over and above the normal, just not just good performance, you need like the best. I actually still prefer using Cloudflare as my CDN, mostly because even though, and I go back and forth on this, like the Google Cloud CDN is arguably just as fast or faster, but Cloudflare, the Cloudflare CDN has more features where you can basically specify page rules for different behavior for different sets of pages, and it has like more security stuff built in, and the pricing is slightly better. So it's like a flat pricing, based off depending on what the bucket you're in. So like for GetHuman, for example, which is the flagship site that we use, this is the sort of setup what I just described, that we use Cloudflare, and GetHuman gets, like this month we'll get 6 million unique visitors, and if we use Google CDN instead of Cloudflare, we would definitely be paying a ton more money, because we use Cloudflare CDN with edge caching turned on. Like basically Cloudflare serves up a lot of the pages themselves, and it doesn't even hit Google at all.
Cool. What were you asking, Bonnie?
Quick pitch, Jeff. What's GetHuman?
Quick pitch. What is GetHuman?
I met Jeff, and I didn't know that he made that website until like a year later. And I was like, oh, that's cool.
Oh, I want to know. Let's go.
Well, yes. So GetHuman is a website that helps you get to a customer service agent at any company faster, that you don't have to wait on hold. We have robots that basically wait on hold for you, and the robot will call you once we get to a live human. And we have some other tools too, but that's like the sort of bread and butter thing that we do these days.
That's cool.
That's actually really cool. Yeah, absolutely. No, I'm definitely glad you brought up the CDN solutions. I'm gonna be completely honest with you. I've never used a cloud-based. I've never used like a CDN service provided by a cloud provider. We use Akamai a lot.
So Akamai is the best. So Akamai. So if you one thing actually. I'll send this in the notes, but if you go to cdnperf.com, it basically is a service, an awesome service that is constant, like every day, testing the CDNs at different places. Akamai is always number one, or almost always number one. Google Cloud CDN is almost right near the top as well, and CloudFront's not too far behind. But the problem is it's so expensive. Like compared to the other options, it is like crazy expensive. So until I work at a large company again, or my company gets that big, it's just not feasible.
But for those who want to know more about Akamai, spell it AKAMAI, AKAMAI. But yes, we use Akamai. We use Akamai very heavily. The funny thing is that as much as I love Akamai, I'm going to highlight a chink in its armor. When you're going towards more of a DevOps friendly culture, or more of like a infrastructure as code culture, DevOps is not, Akamai is not always the most friendly solution. I think in this case, I love the fact that AWS has like CloudFormation, which I know we're going to talk about here in a little bit. I know Google has a similar service. I can't recall what it is, but
deployment manager.
Deployment manager, yes. So, but I think there's a lot of power in being able to codify things such as your CDN layer, being able to codify those rules, pages that need to be updated, things of that nature. I know we ran into the issue of we go through the GUI to update all of our CDN rules and things of that nature, but the auditing history is very limited. You don't really have context for why changes get made. So you're just like clicking and moving along, but you don't really know why you even got to the end state that you're at. You have no context of everything. So if you can put something like a CDN and rules of that nature into some type of CloudFormation template or some type of code and put it in source control, I think that's the ideal way, which is more of a reason as to why you should buy into all of the services that a cloud provider offers versus like picking and choosing which services you would like to use.
Yeah, let's go ahead and just transition to the deployment stuff, because I think it sort of ties to the CDN, sort of the way that you're talking about, like, and I think about this as well, that like, so when I was at Wells, I remember spending like 2 years on this infrastructure project to set up a way of deploying our code so that essentially we can get all of our code out to like a production-like environment where like our team could like test it like actual end production servers, and then we would actually like switch all the traffic over. It was like this big, huge effort, and like we had all sorts of issues and tons of people, so much money spent. And if you utilize these tools that are part of the cloud now, like CloudFormation, you have the CDN manager as part of the cloud. On the Google side, it would be deployment manager and the Google CDN. It's basically built in for you. Like that's what a blue-green deployment is, that you just like totally spin up, like you have it all scripted in your deployment code, and you literally spin up an entire new infrastructure, like entire new set of whatever your infrastructure is using, whether it's Docker instances or whatever, it doesn't even matter. Up a whole new and then helps migrate the traffic over in whichever way you want, whether it's like a 50-50 split or there's different ways to switch the traffic over or whatever. But like I'm seriously, that part, like you cannot even appreciate how hard it was to do that back in the day, and now it's just there. But I don't think people utilize that as much as they should, at least from what I've seen.
Yeah, no, I think for a lot of people that typically work on those kinds of things, as far as like the networking and the CDN layers and things like that, from what I've seen in the past, a lot of those people aren't necessarily what you would call programmers or coders. You know what I'm saying? So those people talk to somebody on the phone, they'll get Akamai on the phone, or get whoever on the phone and say, hey, can you make this change? Can you make this change? Or they might go in the GUI and they might click around, but a lot of people usually with that background aren't that experienced with like using source control, using, versioning all your deployments, things of that nature, which once again is a culture change, right? Because it was at one time where I code it, I throw it over the fence, they put it on the server and they throw it over the fence, and another person deals with the network and they throw it over the fence. And that's just kind of how it was. But now we're getting away from that to where you can literally just codify your entire deployment with your code, and you can all deploy it at the same time, and you can create these immutable infrastructures and things of that nature. And you know whatever you're deploying to the cloud is going to work because you can put it through some type of pipeline and test it along the way.
Yeah, it's funny though. I think that it sounds great, but just coming from my own experience, it's scary when you look at CloudFormation, just as an example. Right?
Absolutely.
Like it's scary at first because it seems like it's so much stuff, and like I feel like your initial reaction is like, oh, I don't want to deal with this. This is the thing, part of infrastructure I don't want to do. I just want to focus on my app or whatever. And so they continue using their VM or their old way of deploying or whatever. Like, what are your thoughts, Reggie, on like how to get people over that mental hurdle?
Man, it's so funny that you asked that question because I'm dealing with it now. The biggest part that I've seen is the hurdle for moving more towards that thought process of DevOps is trust. A lot of it comes down to being able to trust that other person on the other side, which is why it's imperative for developers and infrastructure people and networking people, all these people to work together. And I think all of these people, even though I might not necessarily say I'm just a flat out Angular, reactive, whatever it is, I'm not a programmer, but I can sit with you and get an understanding of what this code is supposed to do. So when it's time to deploy it, now all of a sudden I have a little bit more context to how this thing is supposed to work. And I think those types of things start with just building up the relationships around the office, starting to, build those bridges and things of that nature, and getting people exposed to other types of technology that they aren't necessarily comfortable with. Because the reality of the situation is that as people move more towards automation and cloud development and things of that nature, you're going to have to understand a little bit more about the stack than what you had to understand about it 10 years ago.
Yeah, I found that it was sort of two different levels or two primary things that were causing consternation in myself and other people starting to get into CloudFormation on the AWS side. One was that there is sort of a just understanding of all the different services that's needed. So like, because you're scripting the creation of these cloud resources, if you don't understand, what Beanstalk is and how cloud storage works or whatever, it does make it more difficult because like there's stuff in there that like doesn't seem to make sense. But if you understand how S3 works, for example, and then you look at the part of the resource allocation for S3, then it totally makes sense because it's like a one-to-one matchup with like, oh yeah, this is how you set the permissions and like whatever else. But the other thing, so that there's that part of just understanding all the other services within, whether it's AWS or GCP. But then there's the syntax type thing. The syntax type thing, in my mind, is just I look at it as an equivalent of, like we're developers. We learn language. At least most developers I know learn new languages all the time, and you have to be good at the ability to take the way you've learned things in the past and translate it. And of course, the CloudFormation and Deployment Manager isn't like a full scripting language, like a full like programming languages, but there are similar concepts and similar type of ideas, and it's the same type of hurdle in terms of just figuring out a couple basics to understand of how it works, and then you're golden, and then the rest of the time you just like look it up, like you Google or an example or whatever. But as long as you like understand the basics of like, okay, this is how you nest different scripts together, and this is how you there's a limited set. There's like I think it's like 8 different types of sections, the resources and parameters and like a couple different things.
Yeah.
And it's a limited set that you can actually learn in a relatively short period of time.
Yes.
So I think people, it's probably a bigger hurdle than people think it really. People think it's a bigger hurdle than it actually is.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing, one thing I started specifically doing in my job is I started putting on lunch and learns every Tuesday, because one of the big things is that we had a lot of developers that wanted to kind of interact more with the cloud or They want to learn more about the infrastructure, networking, things of that nature, because when you deploy some code to production and then you got Akamai rewriting your caching rules, you kind of want to know what's going on. You might not know exactly how the CDN layer works, but you kind of want to know, like, why is he rewriting the rules? What can we do? Like, you want a little bit more knowledge of what's going on. And one thing I did was I started doing lunch and learns. And I started doing lunch and learns to cultivate that culture of sharing knowledge, because I think that's kind of what it's all about as you go to the cloud, because there's not going to be one person that just knows everything. I think that idea of like having that single source of truth. If anybody's ever read the book called The Phoenix Project, you should definitely read that book. They actually talk about a specific character in the book where there's this one guy on your team and that one guy knows everything. But when that guy goes, all of that knowledge and tribal knowledge all just disappears. And you're just kind of stuck with all these unknowns within your infrastructure, within your application. So I think definitely to, like, as we've been talking about, kind of to bridge that gap or to collapse that gap or however you want to describe it, I think, creating an environment where it's a lunch and learn or weekly get-togethers with teams or whatever the situation is, where you guys can actually share the knowledge and your specific specialties or your expertise, I think it makes it a lot easier to start moving in that direction to where people aren't as scared of cloud formation and deployments and what's going on in the cloud and things of that nature.
And what do you think, Reggie, is if someone was to ask you, what is the advantage of learning, the code as infrastructure and deployment scripts and that type of thing, as opposed to, obviously there are, each of the cloud environments, both AWS and GCP, have really good managed services, whether it is the Firebase stuff or Beanstalk or App Engine, where you don't necessarily have to know as much and kind of like just push a button or whatever. And people should use that. But like, what is the motivation for why people should go past that and actually learn some of this more advanced stuff?
One thing I always tell my developers about taking the time to actually learn about infrastructure, networking, and those things beyond just like looking at a host of services is gonna make you a better developer tenfold. Simply from the fact of, I think a lot of times what I've seen, especially from front-end developers, and this is no knock on anybody, but sometimes you can have your head down looking at the code so much that you're not really thinking about, hey, whenever I write this code, it's gonna, it's doing this to the processor, it's doing this to the memory, it's doing this to the CPU. You don't think about those things because those things are typically taken care of for you. But I think it's very imperative for us to be aware of, you don't have to necessarily be like a systems expert or anything like that, or an infrastructure expert, but having a level of knowledge and being informed on, how's this thing going to be affected by, being on a server and it's hitting the CDN and the CDN is doing all of these different things, or when this code starts to scale and all, like, I think those are things that we need to start thinking about, because now all of a sudden, instead of you just writing code to make it work, you're writing your code to be more performant and more efficient. And I think that's the most important thing, of having some level of understanding of like how the infrastructure, all these things work. And I always tell my developers, like, you should care about the infrastructure, because at the end of the day, your code is going on top of it. So you can't just write code assuming that we got 16 cores and 64 gigabytes of memory on every server. No, that's not cost efficient. The business is not going to go for that. So you have to sit and think, like, how can I make this thing more efficient? How can I make this thing work harder for me versus having the computer having to throw more hardware at the problem versus me just making my code better?
Yeah, I think this is a good transition to like one of the final things we want to talk about, which is the idea of building a cloud native application, which is sort of what we're touching on here. That there's this concept that's called cloud native, which means that basically you build your application thinking in terms of that it is like you don't build your application in isolation and then try to deploy it to the cloud. You think first and foremost of how, right from the get-go, how this is best going to be architected to leverage all of the different capabilities that are there fully. And the thing is that I think people in general, from what I've seen anecdotally, underutilize this, that they will rebuild certain services, whether it's auth services or message queues or whatever else that is already it's available out there as cloud services, and it is something that you can and should use already. You shouldn't rebuild it yourself. And so I think that moving forward, this is going to happen more and more often, where stuff that has previously been in the domain of custom development will now be just infrastructure. So your ability, your future as a developer, in my opinion, you will be best served if you know and understand at a deep level especially the main core, the big cloud service providers and what they have and how to best leverage them, because you're going to become a better developer. Like you were starting to say, Reggie, like you are a better developer when you know how to use those to your full advantage. You can do things faster. You can do things more cheaply, more robustly, all that type of stuff. And it's something that you would think that we're at the point where that's like obvious, but I still think we're, as much as the cloud environment has matured, I don't think we are at the point yet where people still live in the world of, all right, I'm developing my app and then it just happens to live in the cloud or whatever. And I think there's a fear. Even last time, last month when we talked, there was people asking about the fear of being too intricately tied to the cloud, like of tightly coupling, which that's fair. But I think that fear is a little bit almost too much at this point, and it's prohibiting your ability to build like really awesome stuff.
Absolutely. I definitely do think the idea that I don't want to be tied to a specific cloud provider is very overplayed. Because typically, if you look at most big companies, they have footprints in several cloud providers. That's not crazy to think of anymore. And at the end of the day, there are certain cloud providers that do things better than other cloud providers. And what's not to say that I want to not take advantage of this service from this cloud provider to interact with another service from another cloud provider. I think that's kind of the beauty of the cloud, is that you can kind of retrofit it to be what you need it to be. You can go all in on all of the services from one cloud provider, or you can collaborate on a plethora of services from several cloud providers. It really just all depends on what the business needs are. Oh, oops.
I had muted. I was just saying, yes, I agree.
Cool.
Yeah, any questions over there?
Any questions from anyone? Thoughts, ideas? Nothing?
Yeah, what do people there struggle with? Like, what are people using Google Cloud or AWS, and what services do they use?
Are any of you guys using the cloud at all? No. Wow, that's
fear of like this big unknown thing, right? Actually, I do have a question. If there is, because I know, like, when I'm doing Angular stuff and when I'm training developers, I have certain resources, certain blogs that are my favorites, and certain places that I know there's certain authors of blog posts that I know I go see that and I know they're very reputable and I can trust them. Like ThoughtRam is a good one. So are there resources for people that are kind of trying to dive in? The thing is with when you go and you look at the services that are out there, it's like there's so much to look at. Right?
Correct.
So what kind of, I know Jeff said that he had some resources about security in the cloud. It would be good to have those links. We can check them out after the show. But also resources like that pretty much simplify it for starting. Like if you want to start using the cloud and you just want to like dip in a little toe, and check it out. Like maybe a resource that we could go to for like Hello World in the cloud.
Absolutely. Jeff, I know I have a couple, but Jeff, do you want to talk about yours?
You can go first.
So we got to tweet them out later.
Okay. Okay. I think there are definitely a lot of resources out there. I think, truth be told, the first place I started whenever I dove into the cloud was a website called A Cloud Guru. I think they're absolutely amazing. A Cloud Guru really gets it right, and to the effect of even their website, their entire website is built on a serverless backbone. So like they have an entire like content management system built out. I think I don't know if the front end is Angular React, but A Cloud Guru, like you cannot miss them.
Reputable, like
extremely reputable. They actually put on this serverless conf in Austin every year, so they're like very, very reputable. And I think they're awesome as far as like you want to dip a toe into the cloud. I think Linux Academy is also really good. Don't get thrown off by the name. I think Linux Academy, because they do cover Windows and they cover Linux, but they not only cover just like the cloud in general, but they cover a lot of services that you would use in the cloud. So containers, PaaS. They even started introducing more security classes, things of that nature. They talk about DevOps. So DevOps tools like Jenkins and using different pipelines. I think that's an awesome site to be introduced to a lot of DevOps and cloud services. I think those are probably definitely two of my go-tos as far as like dipping my toe into the cloud. And if anything, you can set up an account with Google or AWS or even Azure for free. And I know AWS specifically, they will give you like an entire year free, like on like a free tier or on a discounted rate, and you can just go in there and like play with all of their services and just see what you can break.
That's cool.
Which, all right, now I don't want to start a war.
No,
so Jeff, the question was presented. Which one is better to start with, Google or AWS? Yes.
Whichever one you start with.
I prefer Google Cloud. I've used both. I prefer Google Cloud, but to be quite honest, they're both the same. I mean, there are certain things I like about Google Cloud that I can make the argument, but to be honest, like they're at the point where they're pretty much feature parity, other than like a couple small like edge things. And I mean, you could argue performance is like arguable, and I mean everything is arguable. So like I don't think honestly you could go wrong, in my opinion. But do you agree?
For the most part, I agree. Yeah, no, because I'm not gonna have a heated discussion, but I'm not gonna lie. I think AWS just blows everybody out of the water. Now, don't get me wrong. Google does some really cool things. So I've used AWS, I've used Google, I've used Azure. I think Google does a lot of good things. Now, from like a really nerdy infrastructure side, Google got networking right. Out the gate, like networking is awesome on Google. The things that you can do with their load balancers, things of that nature are like just a mile in front of everybody else. But I think just from pure maturity and simplicity, I think AWS, and also resources as far as like wanting to get into it and learn more about it, I think AWS is a great place. One of the problems that that I ran into with Google is that if you begin to start trying to architect very complicated solutions, because Google is a little bit of a younger platform, the documentation isn't always there. So you will run into issues with the documentation with Google. I've ran into the same issues with Azure. I think AWS has done a really good job of documenting a lot of their services, as well as I think the tools that are out there for you to use that aren't even necessarily associated with AWS are a lot more mature and more supported by the community, which is a huge thing. For example, if you want to create like serverless web applications, the serverless framework works awesome with AWS. And basically what that does on the back end is like you can basically write the code for your serverless function, and you can deploy it. Like you can deploy it through a pipeline, you can deploy it from your local box, and it'll create a CloudFormation template for you on the back end, and it just deploys it. So it's just like tool sets like that make me kind of favorite towards AWS. But I mean, it just, I think a lot of times it just really depends on what are you trying to do with the cloud. So I think more than ever is very important. Like Jeff mentioned earlier, and I think he was a brilliant point, is you do need to think about the architecture of your solution before you just start coding it, because in the cloud, architecture is everything.
Yeah, I agree with all of your points. The only thing I would add is that over time, the difference that you mentioned between AWS and GCP will become less and less. That
absolutely,
there's more stuff going on there, whatever else, and I do stuff on both AWS and GCP right now, both with our own internal projects and some of our client projects, and we have been able to, because GCP is behind and they are trying to gain market share, it is actually, you can use that to your advantage to leverage to get some good private deals. So that this is part of what we do. So like we have a service called vendorsmith.com, and basically we work with people that actually either both migrations to the cloud, but then also even if you just are on there and you want to optimize your usage. So we create like a architectural plan for you, which is for free, of how to best utilize the cloud. But then we'll do deal negotiation, and we'll basically hold your hand kind of as you do we won't actually do the migration for you. Like that's part of our philosophy, that like we're not actually doing the work, but we can be there to answer questions and support you, basically. So if you are interested in that, check us out at vendorsmith.com, and we'd love to help.
Absolutely. Cool. Any other questions, thoughts, concerns? Yes, sir.
So if you have a fairly high performance application, Jeff made a comment earlier about thinking about the cloud as a developer.
Okay.
So if you have a high performance app, high security,
high performance, high
throughput,
sounds like a government application.
Yeah. So classically, I think from a developer standpoint, almost an afterthought. Whether I'm going to deploy to the cloud, whether I'm going to deploy to a hosted service.
Right.
So I see a little bit of a vacuum there. You got developers kind of easing over into DevOps, and DevOps easing over into development.
Yeah. So the question was presented. If you have an application that's high performance, high throughput, highly secure, things of that nature, that essentially you begin with the way the cloud and DevOps movement is going, that you start seeing developers kind of sliding over to infrastructure network and DevOps side, and then you see DevOps people kind of moving over into the development side. What are your thoughts on that, Jeff?
I don't think that's a bad thing, by the way.
Nah.
Yeah, I mean, it's up to the organization, really, because you can have whatever team setup you want. I've seen different setups for sure, and I'm not sure what the most optimal is. It sort of depends on the culture and what application you're building and what requirements and that type of thing. I personally, for the stuff that we do, take the view of trying to get developers to kind of own the application from end to end, and developers to be the ones who get more into the kind of infrastructure and that type of thing. But I would have no problem having separate teams and figuring out different ways to kind of like separate duties. The one thing though is, if you do have separate teams, I do think it's an advantage to separate more along product boundaries than layers. That like whenever you set up something where a team has to throw something over the wall to another team and they become blockers to one another, that slows everybody down. And so if you can, one thing that we do very differently, or I do very differently today than I did at Wells, is figure out ways to, even if there's like duplication in some cases, both in terms of even data duplication or infrastructure duplication or whatever. But if you can set it up so that people don't have to can be isolated and focused, there's a lot of just business advantages, speed in delivery and that type of thing. Even if it's maybe slightly more cost in some cases.
Yeah, I definitely do agree with you. I think there's going to be overlap. There's definitely going to be overlap, especially once you're adopting into the cloud, just because, like we talked about with the architecture piece being very important, with the developers now becoming a part of that process. Now they're going to be exposed to so much more information than they were when they were just developers. For a long time, it was, hey, we got this application or we got this feature we want to add. Here you have at it. But like what Jeff said, this idea of product ownership is kind of the whole idea of DevOps. I'm no longer owning a feature, I own a product. And I own it from end to end. So that means from the architecture of it, to the development of it, to the build, to the deploy, even to the maintenance of that thing. You own that whole pipeline from end to end. And that is going to require developers to kind of move over into like a sysadmin or a DevOps or infrastructure, whatever role, because of the simple fact that at the end of the day, like, you were a part of the process of architecting out the solution. You were the one that built it, and now you're the person that deploys it, and now it only makes sense for you to be the person that maintains it. I think for so long, some people just kind of got spoiled by the fact that I just write the code and I give it to somebody else, and I don't have to worry about if it's blowing up on a computer or the exception handling. Like, you don't care, because most of the time you give it to sysadmin and they take care of it. But now you kind of got to get rid of that. You got to remove that blocker, because the whole idea for businesses is I want to move faster. And you do slow down your process whenever you just throw it over the fence and say, well, you figure it out, because now the sysadmin got to go and look up the code. If he doesn't know C#, if he doesn't know Java, he doesn't know Angular, guess what I got to go do? I got to go look up the API, and I got to look up all of these other things. So no, it's not a bad thing. I think it does depend on the business need, but I think it's definitely a crucial step in the right direction for a lot of businesses, especially with the speed that businesses want to move today.
And for the end developers, cross-training equals job security.
Cross-training does equal job security, and it also equals more money. I just tell people, just learn the cloud just to make more money. Why not? You can't lose. Any other questions? I did.
I think that's it.
Okay.
So don't forget, if you guys can tweet out, if you want Reggie to tweet out the, what did you say, a cloud guru, and there was one more?
A cloud guru in Linux Academy.
And then also, Jeff mentioned
Linux Academy, yes.
And Jeff mentioned that there was some links for the cloud security.
The cloud.
Where do you want me to post that?
Just tweet it and tag ngHouston, and we'll retweet it.
Okay.
And also, if you guys want to follow Jeff, what's your Whelpley?
Yeah, Jeff Whelpley on Twitter. Yep.
There's an extra L in there, though. It's Whelpley. There's an L before and after the P.
There's only as many L's as are absolutely necessary.
Oh man. Can I say my Twitter handle?
Yes.
Yes. So if anybody,
it kind of freaked me out the first time.
It freaks. Imagine how my employer felt.
Yeah.
But yes, no. If you would like to follow me and the things I'm doing, definitely follow me on Twitter at Mad Black Man, MADBLKMAN. I promise I'm not mad.
I thought he was kind of mean and scary.
Nah, I'm not mad. I'm not angry. I'm not sad, but I'm definitely black.
Why you got that Twitter handle?
Oh yeah. So for people that, okay, so I got the Twitter handle because one of my favorite shows like of all time is Mad Men. If you've ever seen that show, it's amazing. Donald Draper is probably my favorite character in any TV show, and I was taken aback by the fact that there were no black people in the show. So I just kind of made myself the black person in the show. I feel as if I'm like the black Donald Draper. So
But it's not Mad Black Man. It's BLK.
It's BLK, MADBLKMAN. It's like a good conversation starter. That's how I look at it. It's a good conversation starter.
Yeah, I was a little wondering at first. But he's actually not mad at all. He's actually really, really nice.
I like to have a good time.
Yeah. You're a hoot.
Woohoo!
And you're a too, Jeff, and we really appreciate you guys coming. It's like a fireside chat, because I've never had like two guests talking to each other before.
No,
but this is like a different format, but it's kind of cool.
this was cool. I really enjoyed this, Jeff. I really did, man. I know.
Yeah, same here.
Yeah, I know we never got to talk on the phone. We've been emailing, so like for this to be our first interaction is like very memorable. I'm gonna remember you forever, Jeff.
Thank you.
A great friendship beginning.
Yes.
I knew you guys would. See, that's what I do. Like I meet developers.
Bonnie brings people together.
Yeah, Bonnie's the matchmaker.
Yeah.
You really love Jeff Whelpley.
Oh
Especially
man.
because you guys have the whole serverless cloud thing.
Oh yeah, man. I love me some servers.
Right.
Woo-wee. Well, I can talk about that all day in Golang. I love Golang.
Well, thank you so much, you guys.
Cool.
Both of you, I really appreciate y'all coming on. And you guys are both welcome back always, anytime. And we appreciate you. So thank you.
Thank you guys. All right.